Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're on part 2 of the analysis of The Prince, discussion observations of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. If you read part 1, you got a long windup where I was bringing in all sorts of references to understand what this book is about. Power, force, conflict, etc., right? That's what this book is about. And he wrote it to Lorenzo de Medici. So if you go to Google, and you got to be careful when you do that, besides reading it yourself, remember the most important thing you could do is read this book yourself. Don't depend on that. But let's go to Google for a moment. And Google, which now has AI, and we ask them about Machiavelli, you're going to get a distorted view. Because I always told you, read the source. If you depend on other people's opinions about classics like The Prince or anything, you're going to walk away with what might be distorted views, right? You gotta do this yourself. Well, Jimmy, I don't want to take the time. Well, remember what kind of brains that Machiavelli was talking about, right? Or Jim Lovell, right? You watch what happens, you make things happen, or you wonder what happens. Don't wonder, make things, you got to read and understand. So, for example, here's what Google returned when I asked, what are the key takeaways from The Prince? And here they are. What are the key takeaways? The ends justify the means. Rulers should be skilled in war. That makes sense. Rulers should sometimes be cruel. Okay, yeah, blah, 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 blah. So if you read The Prince with me, and I hope you did, otherwise this will not make too much sense, but you should go back and read it. Look at the first response of Google. The ends justify the means. Machiavelli's famous dictum encapsulates the pragmatic approach advocated in the book. Big words, aren't it? Encapsulates. Hey, who talks like that? But it's wrong. It's wrong. What Machiavelli actually wrote, this is right out of The Prince that we read. Everybody sees what you appear to be. Few feel what you are. And those few will not dare to oppose themselves to the many who have the majesty of the state to defend them. And in the actions of men, especially of princes, from which there is no appeal, the end justifies the means. Well, Jimmy, that's what Google just told me. Is it? The ends justify the means. The end justifies the means. Huh! That's not the same thing. There's a letter. See that S there? See that S? Do you see that S? Machiavelli used singular. He didn't use plural. And if you think one little letter doesn't matter, you better think again. Try one digit in math that doesn't, take a digit away from the check you're writing. Or take a digit away little things matter. They do. Machiavelli never said the ends justify the means. He said the end. There's one end. There's a singular. And if you think one letter doesn't matter, think again. And context matters. What was Machiavelli doing? He was writing about the qualities of a prince that must have when he said that famous saying. He was talking, when you're a prince, right, because men, they see what you appear to be. Everybody sees what you seem to be, but few really know who you really are. And he says, in the actions of men, far from which there is no appeal, as you're a prince, the end you do justify the means. But he was talking about this stuff. Quote, a prince must take great care that nothing goes out of his mouth, which is not full of the above-named 5 qualities, and to see and hear him that he should be all mercy, faith, integrity, humanity, and religion. And nothing is more necessary to seem to have than this last quality, religion. For men in general judge more by their eyes than by their hands. You understand? Remember Doubting Thomas? Let a prince therefore aim at conquering force and maintaining the state, and the means will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone. The means, that's the goal. What's the end? conquering and maintaining the state. Maintaining the state is the end. That's the end. So when they say that's the dictum that you apply to everything, so everybody, whoa, Machiavelli said the end justifies the means. No. He was talking about one thing. He was talking about what a prince has to do to maintain the state. And if he does that, and the means will always be judged honorable and praised by everyone. What does that mean? The means. What are the means? Well, sometimes you got to behead a few people. For the vulgar is always taken by appearances and the issue of the event. And the world consists of only the vulgar, and a few who are not vulgar are isolated when many have a rallying point in the prince. Then he gives you an example. Remember, I told you a lot of examples. So it's all about protecting and maintaining the state for a prince. His end justified the means statement isn't a broad brushstroke. It's not, you can take this and apply it to everything. No, he's talking about a prince maintaining a state. That's all he's talking about. Unfortunately, the vulgar, all of us, sometimes, well, I had to do it. I had to do it. Think about some of the history lessons you had. The end justifies the means, right? The end. There's a certain, I don't want to bring this guy up, but I'll bring him up. Hitler. You know what his end was, right? So he had an end in mind, and then the end justified the means. But that was used all wrong if you believe in humanity and morality, right? You don't wipe out 6 million people because you have an end. It's what a prince needs to govern the state. So do you believe that to be true, that the end justifies the means all the time? This is something you should think about. As a boss, a leader, a teacher, right? This is an important thing to think about. Because it leads you to a discussion of morality, which we don't want to get into today. Because the point is, what is the end that you think the means justifies? What do you think? These are important scenarios to go through your mind. Practice Machiavellian courage. He's talking about a prince who has responsibility of keeping the state intact. And ladies and gentlemen, we all have responsibilities, don't we? Right? So I had a teacher who I worked with, and then he went on to go into insurance. And I bought an insurance policy from him. My dad said, you should buy life insurance. I said, okay, Pop. So I bought the insurance policy, and Anthony sold me the policy. And one day I get a letter from the insurance company that my loan has been approved and the money has been, you've got the money. So these are the terms of the contract. And I took no such loan. So I called up Anthony. He says, I got to talk to you. So we met, and he basically admitted to forging my name to get the money that he needed because he was desperate. He used the word, I was desperate, Jim. Jimmy, I was desperate. And those are words, desperate. What does that mean? He says, I'm going to pay you back Monday. I said, well, you committed. This is a crime. You forged my signature to get money. This is a crime. So we talked about it, and, because I'm an English major, I studied English and I study words. I understand when he told me he was desperate. I didn't ask him what he was desperate about, but he was desperate. And he said, you're not the only one I did this to. You must have been really desperate. So I had him write out a confession. And I said, I'm going to take this confession. The money's back, paid with interest back to the company. Pardon me. I won't turn this letter to anybody. I'll destroy the letter. But if it's not there Monday, I'm going to turn you into the cops, because this is a crime. This is a crime. The money was in by Monday. The end justifies the means. What was his end? Whatever it was. He was desperate. That was his feeling. But the means were to really forge my signature to get the money. That's when he's talking about the end justifies the mean, he's talking to the prince to maintain the state. But you and I and everyone else listening, they face these same situations where you have to judge if the end justifies the means. You have to judge these things, which means you have to have some type of moral base. And if you don't have a moral base, then everything is possible, right? The end will always justify the means, which is not true. So the other statements from Google, so you have to read it, etc. So I'd like to finish this analysis with some of the points that stood out to Jimmy, the ones that I pointed out with the red arrows when we read the book together. I'll put them up, I'll read them, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about them. But I encourage all of you to pause my analysis and to think about these things for yourself. When I read something, pause it, think about it for yourself. Because these little tidbits are rich with many, many, many layers of meaning that you should have already realized. And while we can't spend another hour, we can spend 3 more hours doing this. I value time. Time is the only non-renewable resource. So I think the best way to proceed is just to read these, pause, think, and then as your time permits, repeat the process. Come back, stop it, come back, do whatever you want. Because I'm also on YouTube now. Reading with Jimmy. Go on, YouTube and look for Reading with Jimmy. Think about what Machiavelli writes, this magnificent book, and says about your positions of responsibility, about power, about conflict, about using force. So these are the parts. I read 8 parts. This is from part 1. It is necessary to be a prince to know thoroughly the nature of people, and one of the populace to know the nature of princes. We saw that earlier, right? You got to know each other. Why is that true? Pardon me, I had to sip some coffee. Because otherwise you can't communicate. The difficulty of maintaining hereditary states accustomed to a reigning family is far less than new monarchies. So if hereditary if you're hereditary, remember, he doesn't talk about republics. We're going to talk about that in a minute. This is about monarchies, hereditary. It's hereditary. Dynasties. One change always leaves the way prepared for the introduction of another. Ladies and gentlemen, that's one of the rules of life. Change, right? Everything changes. One change, Machiavelli wrote, isn't it? This is a beautiful quote. One change always leaves the way prepared for the introduction of another. So in other words, you can make lemonade out of lemons. Or as Duke Ellington said, a problem is a chance to show your best. Think about this. Men change masters willingly, hoping to better themselves. There is isn't that true, right? There is an inevitable harm on those over whom the prince obtains dominion, both by his soldiers and by the infinite number of injuries caused by his occupation. There is an inevitable harm inflicted on those over whom the prince obtains dominion. Isn't that true? A new boss comes in and he fires people, right? Right? You will always need the favor of the inhabitants to take possession of a province. If you take over a department, you're going to need the favor of the people who work there, right? You see this guy? States which on annexations are united to a previously existing state may or may not be of the same nationality and language. If they are the same nationality and language, it is very easy to hold them. Remember, he's talking to Lorenzo. Especially if they are not accustomed to freedom. And to possess them securely, it suffices that the family of the princes which formerly governed them to be extinct. In other words, get rid of them. Well, Jimmy, that's pretty cruel. No, he's talking to Lorenzo, the prince. The other and better remedy is to plant colonies in 1 or 2 of those places which form, as it were, the keys of the land. For it is necessary either to do this or to maintain a large force of armed men. He's giving advice to Lorenzo on how to control the state and maintain the state. It must be noted that men must either be caressed or else annihilated. They will revenge themselves for small injuries, but they cannot do so for great ones. The injury, therefore, that we do to a man must be such that we need not fear his vengeance. There was a movie with Robert Duvall where he played a lawyer. I forgot the name of the movie. I'm sorry. But the line that I'm thinking of is that he said, if you're going to hit a man, make sure you hit him so he doesn't get up. Make sure you hit him so he doesn't get up. That's what Machiavelli's saying. Right? Well, Jimmy, he's talking to the prince, right? Yeah. Well, does the prince hit? Well, he's saying men must either be caressed, loved, or annihilated. It's a prince. It's the prince. In every way, therefore, a garrison is as useless as colonies are useful. Knowing afar off, which it is only given to a prudent man to do, the evils that are brewing, they are easily cured. When you know something bad is happening far off, you can deal with it. You can deal with it easily. But when, for want of such knowledge, they are allowed to grow, these things, right, the evils, to grow, so that everyone can recognize that they are there, there's no longer any remedy to be found. In other words, you remember, not that I like it, but Barney Fife, nip it, Andy, nip it in the bud, right? When you know something's wrong and you don't deal with it, it's only going to get worse. It's only going to get worse. You gotta nip it. You gotta deal with it. Right? The Romans, observing disorders while yet remote, were always able to find a remedy. There's this example. And they never allowed them to increase in order to avoid war, because the Romans knew that war is not to be avoided, but it can only be deferred to take advantage of the other side. Isn't that interesting? You can't avoid war, but you can control when you fight war, right? Do you understand how true that is? Fight on your own terms. Choose your battle. Time brings with it all things, and it may produce indifferently either good or evil. Tell me that's not true. Well, Jimmy, that's pretty obvious. Is it? Because when good or evil, when evil strikes, you're thinking, oh God, and when good strikes, well, it's about time, right? But it produces it indifferently. Time brings with it, time produces indifferently. It has nothing to do with good or it's just time. Part 2. One ought never to allow a disorder to take place in order to avoid war. For war is not thereby avoided, but only deferred to your disadvantage rather. So he just said that up here, what the Romans used to do. So he's repeating it. One ought never to allow disorder to take place to avoid a war. For war is not avoided, it's only deferred to your disadvantage. A general rule, which never or very rarely fails, is that whoever is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined himself. For that power is produced by him either through craft or force, and both of these are suspected by the one who has been raised to power. So if you help someone gain power, you're ruining yourself. Is that true? Do you believe that? Have you ever done that? Have you ever helped someone gain power and then got screwed? I'm thinking of one example in a major company where that happened. It came time one day, and the board of directors, which the president had raised, right, from nothing. He got them appointed to the board. He ran the company, and then they betrayed him one day and threw him out. right? I'm not talking about Apple, Steve Jobs, although that did happen to him too. I'm talking about other private companies. You raise people to power and you ruin yourself. In republics, there is greater life. I want you to pay attention to this. In republics, there is greater life, greater hatred, and more desire for vengeance. They, republics, do not and cannot cast aside the memory of their ancient liberty, so that the surest way is to either lay them to waste or reside in them. So if the prince conquers a republic, what is the United States of America, ladies and gentlemen? It's a republic. It's a republic. Why? Because a republic means you have the ancient liberty. You're free, freedom. It's hard to govern a republic. So if you do conquer a republic, you have to lay them waste, or you reside in them. You live in them. Men walk almost always in the paths trodden by others, proceeding in their actions by imitation. There's nothing new under the sun. Men always walk in the paths trodden by others, proceeding in their actions by imitation. And a prudent man should always follow in the path of the trodden by great men and imitate those who are most excellent, so that if you do that and he does not attain their greatness, at any rate, he will get some tinge of greatness. Isn't that interesting? There's that prudent word again. It must, it must be considered that there is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new order of things. Would you pay attention to this, please? For the reformer has enemies in all those who profit by the old order. And the reformer only has a lukewarm defender in all those who would profit by the new order. And this lukewarmness, arising partly from fear of their adversaries who have the laws in their favor, and partly from the incredulity of mankind, who do not believe in anything new until they have had actually experience of it. Do you know a situation like this? I do. Email me, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, if you know what I'm talking about. Machiavelli's talking about this, and this just happened. Pardon me. Thus it comes about that all armed prophets have conquered and unarmed ones have failed. For besides what has already been said, the character of people vary, and it is easy to persuade them of a thing, but it is difficult to keep them in that persuasion. And so it is necessary to order things so that when they no longer believe, they can be made to believe by force. That's interesting, isn't it? What's he saying? Part 3, we're on chapter 7 of Machiavelli's book. These that depend absolutely on the goodwill and fortune of those who have raised them, princes, both of whom are extremely inconstant and unstable, for they neither know how to nor are in a position to maintain their rank. For unless he be a man of great genius, it isn't likely that one who has always lived in a private position should know how to command. And they are unable to maintain themselves because they possess no forces friendly to and faithful to them. Moreover, states quickly form, like all other things of rapid beginnings and growth, they cannot have deep roots and wide ramifications so that the first storm destroys them. Unless, as already said, the man who thus becomes a prince is of great genius, so as to be able to take immediate steps for maintaining what fortune has thrown into his lap and lay afterwards those foundations which others make before becoming princes. So what goes up must come down, rise quickly, fast up, fast down, right? It was therefore necessary to disturb the existing condition and bring about disorders in the state of Italy in order to obtain secure mastery over part of them. This is very important. Sometimes you need to disturb the existing condition. You do a little, I got to do this in order to do that. Sometimes they call that the squirrel. Look at this instead of that, right? This is about Caesar Borgia, who Machiavelli admires, at least the way he did these things. Caesar Borgia feared that a new successor to the states of the church might not be friendly to him, and they might seek to deprive him of what Alexander, his father, the Pope, had given him. And so Caesar Borgia sought to provide against this in 4 ways. Remember who he's writing it to, Lorenzo, and he's giving him an example. First, by destroying all who were of the blood of the ruling families which he had despoiled, in order to deprive the Pope of any opportunity. Secondly, by gaining the friendship of the Roman nobles, so that he might, through them, hold, as it were, the Pope in check. And thirdly, by obtaining a great hold on the college of cardinals as he could. Fourthly, by acquiring such power before the Pope died as to be able to resist alone the first onslaught. His father, once Pope Alexander died. Of these 4 things, he had, at the death of Alexander, his father, accomplished 3 of them, and the 4th he had almost accomplished. But he never thought, the unforeseen, that his father's death would be by dying himself. He never thought he'd be dying himself, so he didn't count on his own death. Those are the intangibles, fortune, right? Whereupon the Duke decided to depend no longer on fortunes and the arms of others. The Duke is Caesar Borgia. If any cruelty had taken place, it was not only by his orders, but through the harsh disposition of his minister. He put a guy in between him and the people, which just happened, which happened in a company I used to work for. Right? The rulers put in a layer of vice presidents in between them and the people that work there so they can blame the vice presidents for the actions. Very clever. And having found the opportunity, he had himself, listen to this, if you remember it, he had him cut in half and placed one morning in the square at Chenza with a piece of wood and blood-stained knife by his side. Whoever therefore deems it necessary in his new principality to secure himself against enemies and gain friends. This is pretty bold stuff, right? I'm not suggesting you cut people in half and leave them in the square. He's talking about the prince. The prince in those days, right? To make himself beloved and feared by the people, followed and reverenced by the soldiers, to destroy those who can and may injure him, introduce innovations into old customs, be severe and kind, magnanimous, liberal, blah, 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 create a new one, maintain the friendship of kings, da-da-da-da-da, and he can find no better example in doing all of this to be a great prince than Caesar Borgia. Whoever thinks that in high personages new benefits cause old offenses to be forgotten makes a great mistake. Whoever thinks that in high personages new benefits will cause old offenses to be forgotten makes a great mistake. Don't think that they're going to forget. It cannot be called virtue to kill one's fellow citizens, betray one's friends, be without faith, be without pity, without religion. By these methods one may indeed gain power, but not glory. Whence it is to be noted that in a state, the conqueror must arrange to commit all of his cruelties at once. Do it all at once, the cruelties, so as not to have to recur them every day. So as to be able, by not making fresh changes, to reassure the people and win them over time by benefiting them. Don't stretch out your cruelty. Whoever acts otherwise, either through timidity, you don't do anything cruel, or bad counsel, is always obliged to stand with a knife in hand, meaning they're going to attack you, and you can never depend on your subjects because they, owing to a continually fresh injuries, are unable to depend on you. It's talking to Lorenzo. For injuries should be done altogether, so that being less tasted, they will give less offense. And benefits should all be granted little by little. Dish them out slowly, so that they may be better enjoyed. And above all, a prince must live with his subjects in such a way that no accident of good or evil fortune can deflect him from his course. For necessity arising in adverse time, you are not in time with severity, and the good that you do does not profit, as it is judged to be forced upon you, and you will derive no benefit whatever on it. The timing you do things is everything. There's a saying in business that timing is everything. It is. Sometimes timing is more important than what you're doing. Part 4. When the nobility see that they are unable to resist the people that they unite in exalting one of their number and creating him prince, so when the nobility see that they are unable to resist the people, and they unite in exalting one of their number to be a prince, so that as they be able to carry out their own designs under the shadow of his authority. So when nobles find out that they can't resist the people, they make up a prince. The populace, on the other hand, when they're unable to resist the nobility, when they realize they can't resist the nobility, endeavor to exalt and create a prince in order to be protected by the prince. So he who becomes a prince by help of the nobility has greater difficulty in maintaining his power than he who is raised by the populace. Isn't that the truth? I know a situation that's going on right now where this is true. Do you know the situation I'm thinking about? If the people raise you to power, or if the nobility raise you to power. What's Machiavelli saying here? Obviously, the people raise you to power has great, maintaining power is better when people do it. Besides, it's impossible to satisfy the nobility by fair dealing and without inflicting injury on others, whereas it's very easy to satisfy the mass of people in this way. Pay attention, for the aim of the people is more honest than that of the nobility. And that the latter, the people, or the nobility, desiring to oppress, and the former merely to avoid oppression. Nobility wants to oppress, people want to avoid oppression. So it must be added that the prince can never insure himself against a hostile populace on account of their number. Can't do it when there's too many people, right? But the prince can, right, insure himself against the hostility of the great, as there are only a few. Nobility, right? The worst that a prince has to expect from a hostile people is to be abandoned. That's the worst. The prince is moreover to oblige to live always with the same people, but he can easily do without the same nobility. Isn't that the truth? Think about that. The prince is moreover obliged to live always with the same people, but he can easily do without the same nobility. I think. Think about that in a business situation, right? The boss can live with the same people, but he can easily do so without the same managers. And who did they fire sometimes? What did Elon Musk do when he bought Twitter? You remember what he did? He fired everybody, not just the nobility. There was a great outcry. Oh, look at this guy. He's still in business. He's still making money. But when they are not bound to you of set purpose and for ambitious ends, it is a sign that they think more of themselves than of you. And from such men, the prince must guard himself and look upon them as secret enemies who will help to ruin him. So if people are not bound to you with a set purpose and for ambitious ends, it's a sign that they think more of themselves than of you. People asking for nothing but not to be, the people ask for nothing but not to be impressed. They just don't want to be oppressed. But one who against the people's wishes becomes the prince by favor of the nobles should above all endeavor to gain the favor of the people. And this will be easy to him if he protects the people. And as men who receive good from whom they expected evil, they feel under a great obligation to their benefactor, so the populace will soon become even better disposed towards him than if he had become the prince through their favor. The prince can win the favor in many ways. Men who received good from whom they expected evil, they feel under greater obligation to their benefactor. So if they expected you to be a jerk and you're good, they feel an obligation. Whoever has strongly fortified his town, and as regards the government of his subjects, has proceeded as we have already described and will further relate, will be attacked with great reluctance. They're not going to do anything if you fortify yourself. For men are always adverse to enterprises in which they foresee difficulties, and it can never appear easy to attack anyone who has his town stoutly defended and is not hated by the people. Right? Take care of your own house. A prince, therefore, who possesses a strong city and does not make himself hated, cannot be assaulted. It is the nature of men to be as much bound by the benefits that they confer as by those they receive, from which it follows that everything considered, a prudent prince will not find it difficult to uphold the courage of his subjects, both at the commencement and during the state of siege, if he possesses provisions and means to defend himself. Some of these things that I'm reading, well, Jimmy, they don't really apply to me. I want you to do what I told you in the beginning. Pause, reread them, and think about them when you're talking about power, conflict, force, control, right? Part 5. Ruin is only deferred as long as the assault is postponed. In peace, you are despoiled by them, and in war by the enemy. The cause of this is that they have no love or motive to keep them in the field beyond a trifling wage. These are mercenaries, which is not enough to make them ready to die for you. Remember, Machiavelli said, you're only as good as you should keep your own troops, not mercenaries or auxiliaries. They are quite willing to be your soldiers as long as you don't make war, but when war comes, they leave, they fly, or they decamp altogether. If the man sent turns out incompetent, it must change him. And if capable, you keep him by law from going beyond the proper limits. And it is seen by experience that only princes and armed republics make very great progress, whereas mercenary forces do nothing but harm. And they also, an armed republic submits less easily to the rule of its citizens than a republic armed with foreign forces. That's a Rome example. In one day, they lost what they had laboriously gained in 800 years. He's talking about a specific example here. For with these forces, the mercenary forces, only slow and trifling acquisitions were made, but sudden and miraculous losses, because they ran away. And as I have cited these examples from Italy, which now for many years have been governed by mercenary forces. When you ask a powerful neighbor to come to your aid and defend one with his forces, they are termed auxiliaries. There's your definition. And they are as useless as mercenaries. These forces, auxiliaries, may be good in themselves, but they are always dangerous for those who borrow them. For if they lose, you are defeated. And if they conquer, you remain their prisoner. So if you're being attacked and you ask, remember, this is all about power, telling the prince how to govern. In short, the arms of others either fail, overburden, or impede you. Don't depend on other people. Depend on your own forces. A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought or any other thing to study but war, its organization. We read this, and I put it in here again for you to think about it, okay, and read it again. Very important. And he gives an example. Francesco Sforza, through being well armed, became from private status the Duke of Milan. And then his sons, through wishing to avoid the fatigue and hardship of war, from dukes became private citizens. They didn't maintain it. Their father did, but then they lost it. For among evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible. He gives a lot of attention to being armed, doesn't he? Among the evils caused by being disarmed, it renders you contemptible. There's that sentence there. Because there is no comparison whatever between an armed and a disarmed man. Remember that? The armed man, you're going to do what he says. The disarmed man can't make you do anything. You understand that? And therefore, a prince who is ignorant of military matters, besides other misfortunes already mentioned, cannot be esteemed by his soldiers, nor have confidence in them. Many have imagined republics and principalities in which have never been seen or known to exist in reality. So many imagine they have these idealistic thoughts. For how we live is so far removed from how we ought to live, that he who abandons what is done for what ought to be done will rather learn to bring about his own ruin than his preservation. So if you're worried about bringing stuff, right, that should be done, that ought to be done, rather than what is done, you're doomed. You got to be a realist, ladies and gentlemen. A man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily come to grief among so many who are not good. You understand this? Therefore, it's necessary for a prince who wishes to maintain himself to learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge and not use it according to necessity of the case. Be prudent. You have to learn not to be good. That's a stunning statement. Do you believe that? How hard is it to discipline your child? How hard is that to learn not to be? Because when my mother smacked me once, right? Until my aunt, took her, she was beating the hell out of me for doing something stupid, something dumb. She had just bought me a new school bag, and where I lived at that time, in Chicago, it was cold. So we were using our school bags to throw down the ice, like ice pucks. And she saw what I had done to the new school bag, which she had paid good money for, and just started on me. And then my aunt heard the commotion, came over, pulled her off. And then she realized what she was. I wasn't bloody or anything. It was an amazing event. It's still in my mind after all these years. And what did I learn? Never to throw my school bag. Is that cruel? Learn how to not to be good. The emotion, something got into her, because my mom was a gentle lady. But something got into her at that moment, and I got the crap beat out of me. Right? And it was, was she cruel to me? Yeah. Today, child abuse. No, it wasn't. I did something stupid. I deserved it. But I can assure you I never did it again. Ever. Taught me a lot. Leaving on one side, then, those things which concern only an imaginary prince, and speaking of those that are real, I state that all men, especially princes, who are placed at a greater height, are reputed for certain qualities which either bring them praise or blame. So it is necessary that he should be prudent. There's that word again, isn't it? And to avoid the scandal of vices which would lose him the state, and guard himself, if possible, against those which would not lose it for him. But if not able to, he can indulge them with less scruple. Pardon me. It will be found that some things that seem virtues would, if followed, lead to one's ruin, and some others, which appear to be vices, result in your security and well-being. That seems like a contradiction. Can you think of some vices that will result in your security and well-being? Can you think of virtues that would be your ruin? If you're too good, can you be too good? Can you be too nice? Remember the saying, nice guys finish last. What does that mean, nice? Liberality, as such a word understands it, will injure you because if used virtuously in a proper way, it will not be known and you will incur the disgrace of a contrary vice. The liberality is very necessary to a prince who marches with his armies and lives by plunder, sack, and ransom. You have to be liberal, right? Share. And is dealing, but if you share, it will injure you if used virtuously, because no one will know you're sharing. Right? Well, Jimmy, what if I do a good deed? I don't want everybody necessarily to know it. No, you don't. But if you're a prince, it's not going to help you. And in dealing with wealth of others, for without it, he would not be followed by his soldiers. And you may be very generous, Lorenzo, indeed, with what is not the property of yourself or your subjects, as it were Cyrus, Cyrus, and Alexander. For spending the wealth of others will not diminish your reputation, but will only increase it. Only spending your own resources will injure you. There's nothing which destroys itself so much as liberality, for by using it, you lose the power of using it. Think about that. By using it, you lose the power of using it. It's gone. There is nothing which destroys itself so much as liberality, for by using it, you lose the power and become poor, despicable, or to escape poverty, rapacious and hated. And of all the things that a prince must guard against, the most important is being despicable or hated. And liberality will lead you to one or the other of these conditions. So therefore, it's therefore wiser to have the name of a miser, be a miser, let them call you a miser, which produces disgrace without hatred. Then you incur the necessity of the name of being rapacious, greedy, which produces both disgrace and hated. Chapter 17, cruelty, clemency, whether it's better to be feared or loved. This is probably one of the most famous parts of The Prince. Pay attention. Every prince must desire to be considered merciful and not cruel, but he must take care not to misuse this mercifulness. A prince, therefore, must not mind being incurred the charge of cruelty for the purpose of keeping a subject united and faithful. Right? Fear. My dad was not a mean man, but he was different. Let's put it that way. So there was a fear created by my father. I'm going to tell your father, my mother would say. And then my father would come home, and sometimes she would tell him and sometimes she wouldn't. But there was fear. He never hit us, but there was fear. He must also be cautious in believing and acting and must not be afraid of his own shadow, the prince, and must proceed in a temperate manner, prudence and humanity, so that too much confidence does not render him incautious, and too much diffidence does not render him intolerant. From this arises the question whether to be loved more or feared more than loved. The reply is one ought to be both, feared and loved. But since it's difficult for the two to go together, it's much safer to be what? Feared than loved. If one of the two has to be wanting, for it may be said that men in general, that they are ungrateful, voluble, dissemblers, anxious to avoid danger, covetous of gain. And as long as you benefit them, they're entirely yours. But if they'll offer you their blood, their goods, their life, and their children, as I have said before, when the necessity is remote. But when it approaches, they revolt. No, I don't want to do it. And the prince who has relied solely on their words without making other preparations is ruined. For the friendship which is gained by purchase and not through grandeur and nobility of spirit is brought not secured, and at a pinch is not to be expended in your service. And men have less scruple in offending the one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. For love is held by a chain of obligation, which means men being selfish. It's broken whenever it serves their purpose. And whereas fear is maintained by a dread of punishment, and fear never fails. That's pretty true, isn't it? Still, a prince should make himself feared in such a way that if he does not gain love, he at any rate avoids hatred. For fear and the absence of hatred go well together. Will always be attained by one who abstains from interfering with the property and citizens of the others, or with women. And when he is obliged to take the life of anyone, let the prince do so when there is a proper justification and manifest reason for it. But above all, he must abstain from taking the property of others. For men forget more easily the death of their father than the loss of patrimony. Jimmy worked at one job where he was going to get fired. He found out he's going to be fired, but he could stay as long as he wants, whatever. And he went around to the managers. I may have told you this story in another analysis. And he asked the managers to sign a petition to keep him. None of them would sign. There were 7 guys I worked for. None of them would sign this petition to the vice president, who had all the power of firing and hiring. One guy that I admired greatly, Dennis, was actually crying in front of me. He cried. Did you ever see a grown man cry? He was crying in front of me and said, he had a family. He wished he could do it. I'm sorry. I said, don't worry about it. I get it. But I already had a job lined up when I pulled the trigger on quitting, actually being fired. And then I eventually quit because why would you want to stay once they fired you? I'm not a prince, but this is valid, what he's talking about here, about people and support and loyalty. Above all, he must abstain from taking property of others, for men forget more easily. We said that. But when the prince is with his army and has a large number of soldiers under his control, it's extremely necessary that he shouldn't mind being thought cruel, for without this reputation, he couldn't keep the army. I conclude, therefore, with regard to being feared and loved, that men love at their own free will, but fear at the will of the prince, and that a wise prince must rely on what is in his power and not on what is in the power of others. And he must contrive to avoid incurring hatred, as has been explained. Part 7. Of this one can furnish an infinite number of modern examples and show how many times peace has been broken and how many promises rendered worthless by the faithlessness of princes. He's talking about breaking your word. I'm going to leave this up here for a moment, and you can read this long one. For a prince to have the above-named qualities, he names some of the qualities, right? It would be dangerous to possess them and always observe they are dangerous. What are the qualities? Merciful, faithful, humane, sincerity, and religious. Right? You must have a mind so disposed that when it is needful to be otherwise, you may be able to change to the opposite qualities, the fox, right? And it must be understood that a prince, especially a new one, cannot observe all those things which are considered good in men, being often obliged to maintain the state, to act against faith, against charity, against humanity, against religion. And therefore the prince must have a mind disposed to adapt itself according to the wind, not flip-flop, but if you're going to maintain the state, you got to be able to change, right? As variations of fortunes dictate. And as I said before, not deviate from what is good if possible, but be able to do evil if constrained. That's a hard one. Do you think it was easy for Eisenhower to send those guys on D-Day? Was that evil to send all those men to their death? Oh, we were fighting a war, Jimmy. Yeah, it's tough, right? That's not doing evil, is it? Is it doing evil to kill somebody? Well, it's war. Yeah. And this is a prince to maintain the state. These are tough questions, ladies and gentlemen. This is not easy. A prince must take great care that nothing goes out of his mouth which is not fully observed in the five qualities. And we read that. He's rendered despicable by being thought changeable, frivolous, effeminate, timid, and irresolute. So the prince must guard against these things. Don't be considered these things. Experience shows us there have been many conspiracies, but few have turned out well. For whoever conspires cannot act alone and cannot find companions except among those who are discontented. And as soon as they have disclosed your intention to a malcontent, you give him the means of satisfying himself, for by revealing it, he can hope to secure everything he wants. He's basically saying, keep your mouth shut. I say that on the side of the conspirator, there's nothing to fear, but fear, jealousy, suspicion. There's nothing but fear, jealousy, suspicion, and the dread of punishment if you're the conspirator. And that frightens him. But on the side of the prince, there's the majesty of government, the laws, the protection of friends. So he's talking, because there's always conspirators, right? So when these things add up to the goodwill of the people, it's impossible that anyone should have the temerity to conspire. It wouldn't even dream of doing it. So a prince should trouble little about conspiracies when the people are well disposed. But when they're hostile, right, he got to fear everything and everybody. He's got to look around his shoulder all the time. Well-ordered states and wise princes have studied diligently not to drive the nobles to desperation, to satisfy the people, keep them content, and that's what's important for a prince to do. A prince who wishes to maintain the state is often forced to do evil. There it is again, right? He's forced to do it. When it must be noted that this kind of death assassination, which proceeds from a deliberate action of a determined man, cannot be avoided. You cannot avoid assassination. Right? You can't avoid it. Can't avoid it. Since anyone who does not fear death himself can inflict it. But a prince need not fear much on this account, because such men are extremely rare. Part 8. New prince is never known to disarm his subjects. On the contrary, when he has found them, he should arm them. Without doubt, princes become great when they overcome difficulties, obligations, etc. You can read this for yourself. As the matter requires it, I will not omit to remind the prince who has newly taken his state with the secret help of its inhabitants that he must consider well the motives that have induced those people who have favored him. It's much easier to gain the friendship of those men who were contented with the previous condition and were therefore at first enemies than those who are not contented and become his friends and help him to occupy it. Nothing causes a prince to be so much esteemed as great enterprises and giving proof of prowess. You can read these on your own. Pause. Right? A prince ought never to make common cause with one more powerful than himself to injure another, unless necessity forces him to do it. All right? For if he wins, good. A prince must also show himself a lover of merit and give preferment to be able and honor those who excel in every art. So be fair. You can read this on your own. The choice of ministers all right, a prince's ministers is a matter of no little importance. In other words, it's very important. And they're either good or not, according to the prudence of the prince. Remember, this is the first impression that we talked about, right, with the brains. We read that already. A prince may be able to know a minister. There is this method which never fails. So a prince will be able to know a minister. Here's the method to know the guy you're hiring. When you see that the minister thinks more of himself than of you, and in all his actions seeks his own profit, such a man will never be a good minister. And you can never rely on him. For whoever has in his hand the state of another, must never think of himself, but of the prince, and not mind to do anything that relates to him. Loyalty, ladies and gentlemen, loyalty. You can't think about yourself. You have to think about other people. Men take pleasure in their own things and deceive themselves about them, that they would take great difficulty guard against what? Flattery. Men take such pleasure in their own things, and so they deceive themselves, he's telling Lorenzo, about them, that they can have difficulty guarding against the plague, this plague, flattery. And by wishing to guard against flattery, they run the risk of becoming contemptible, because there is no other way of guarding oneself against flattery than by letting men understand that they will not offend you by speaking the truth. But when everyone can tell you the truth, you're going to lose all their respect. You can't believe everybody. So a prudent prince must therefore take a third course by choosing for his counsel wise men and giving these alone full liberty to speak the truth to him, but only those things which he asks, nothing else. He must ask them about everything and hear their opinion, and afterwards deliberate himself in his own way. And in these counsels and with each of these men comport himself, so that everyone may see that the more freely he speaks, the more he will be acceptable. Beyond these, he should listen to nobody and go about the matter deliberately and be determined in his decisions. And whoever acts otherwise acts precipitously, right? So you can't believe everybody. So you appoint some people, you appoint the people who are more interested in preserving the state. Men will always be false to you unless they are compelled by necessity to be true. Is that true? I don't know. Men are much more taken by the present than the past, and when they find themselves well off in the present, they enjoy it and they don't seek anything more. But they will do all they can do to defend the prince when they're happy. Having never in quiet times considered the things that might change, this is very important. Having never in quiet times considered those things that might change, like the common fault of men is not to reckon storms in fair weather, when adverse times came, they only thought of fleeing instead of defending themselves. They're not prepared. Only those defenses are good, certain, and durable when depend on yourself and your own ability. Fortune is the ruler of our actions, but that she allows the other half or thereabouts to be governed by us. And I would compare her to an impetuous river when turbulent. We talked about that, right? The prince who bases himself entirely on fortune is ruined when fortune changes. So I also believe that he is happy whose mode of procedure accords. And men, in those things that lead them to aim that each men in those things which lead them to the aim that each one has his own view, namely glory and riches, proceed in various ways. One with circumspection, another with impetuosity, one with violence, another by cunning, etc. I'll let you read this last one here. Well, let me read it. For it happens that time and circumstance are favorable to one who acts with caution and prudence, he will be successful. But if time and circumstance change, he's going to be ruined because he does not change his mode of procedure. You got to change. Adapt, change, or disappear. No man is found so prudent as to be able to adapt himself to this change in fortune. Right? You can read the rest. So I conclude that fortune varying men and men find that are fixed in their ways, they are successful as long as those ways conform to fortune, circumstances. But when they are opposed to that, they're unsuccessful. That seems like common sense. I certainly think that it is better to be impetuous than cautious. Women are not going to like this. For fortune is a woman, and it is necessary if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force. And it can be seen that she lets herself be overcome by bold rather than by those who proceed coldly. That's not true necessarily, right? In those days, perhaps, I don't know. I didn't live in those days. But fortune is fortune. It's not a woman or a man, it's just fortune. It's luck. Frank Sinatra had a great song, Luck Be a Lady Tonight. I encourage you to find that song and listen to it. You've been reading with Jimmy. This concludes part 2 of Jimmy's analysis of Machiavelli's classic, The Prince, and I hope you enjoyed it. In this part 2, we were reviewing some of the arrows from the various readings and just thinking about them and talking about them casually. The best way to proceed is to read the first part of this analysis and then go back and reread each part. It's going to make much more sense. You'll get a much better appreciation of power. Because remember, we read to find out how other people lead their life and how to lead our own. And this guy Machiavelli, he put together this great, great document that is still true today. There's many things in here that if you look around are still true about power, conflict, force. And don't forget my rubber band analogy, ladies and gentlemen, when you're dealing with power. Because if you're not dealing with now, if you're still young, you're still going to deal with it. Be sure to visit and read other classics on my website. Remember, if you have a question, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye. Have a great day.